Hello. So this video is a little bit spontaneous and quite personal, but I think it's very important because I think there are a lot of people out there who are lonely in regards to this issue, and if I could maybe give them a little sense of empathy, then it's worth it. And the subject I want to talk about is virginity. The idea of virginity, or more precisely involuntary celibacy. Now, before I get into this, it's important to get into some terminology here. Virginity is just the act of not having had sex, right? Sexual intercourse, specifically. You may have been in intimate situations without having had full penetration sex. But what I want to talk about is the involuntary side of it, because virginity can fall into a lot of categories, or rather several different categories. So for example, you have people who are virgins for religious reasons, because they don't believe in sex before marriage, and I'll come back to that. You have people who just aren't that interested in it. They genuinely just don't care that much. Asexual, for example. It's a bit unusual, but people like that are out there, and full respect to them. That's their choice. What I want to talk about is the sector of people who are perhaps facing the most stigma or the most isolation. That is people who haven't had sex and who want the experience of sex. Just to put it bluntly, there's no other way to say it, just to say that bluntly, and I suspect that it's probably more people than one might think, because in Western society, and particularly in this country, the British tend to be seen as quite stiff. I would say the opposite's true. This idea that we're quite conservative and things like that. Okay, maybe you can look at legislation or whatever, but in terms of actually social attitudes, if we consider, for example, over the last 20 or 30 years, and I think this ties in with the ladette culture, one night stands, etc., it's definitely loosened up, so to speak. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I can see negatives and positives with it, although I'm not a fan of ladette culture per se, but that's for another video. Anyway, it links into that because it normalizes casual sex, and it normalizes regular sex. But even if you look at popular culture, I mean, I love Friends when it was on, but all the characters spoke about relationships and sex as if they were just regular occurrences. There weren't, perhaps it was one flaw in the writing, with the exception that Ross was out of his relationship for just over 6 months. There was never a period where any of the friends were single for a very long time, really. And that doesn't really reflect the real world. And don't get me wrong, I love Friends, it's a great show, but in the real world, so I'm just trying to get the right lighting here. In the real world, a lot of people go through the loneliness that comes from not having that sort of intimacy. Now, I think that loneliness itself takes different forms. You can have loneliness whereby you just want company. I remember once I'd missed my train in central London, and I just wanted to be around human beings. It was a strange thing. It was after the Live 8 concert. I just wanted to be around human beings. I didn't care that they were total strangers. It's a strange thing, but I was walking through a more quiet part of the city. This was the early hours of the morning, trying to find a hostel. It was a rough night. I basically slept rough that night, but basically I went to Trafalgar Square because I just wanted to be around humanity. Strange, because sometimes, of course, the worst loneliness is in a crowd. But I don't think that people really appreciate just how profound an impact being an involuntary celibate can have. as in, it's not a choice. People who want sexual relations, but for one reason or another, and there's a whole range of factors which I'll get into in a minute, but they just don't get it. It's a very sad thing because it causes so much unhappiness and loneliness, mental anguish, and the attitude of society. You still hear the virgin jokes, you still hear the incel jokes, and criticism of men in particular. Oh, the guy must be a virgin, the guy must be... It's used as a way to mock people, it's used as a way to bash masculinity in particular. Although, I'm not going to say that there isn't pressure on young women as well, because there certainly is. I'd imagine in girls' schools, for example, where bullying is very high, a girl that appears to not have boyfriends, she's probably going to get stick as well. But, this is unfortunately something you still see in society. Virginity is seen as something to mock. Like, it's a flaw. Like this person, it's even used as a criticism. Like if someone's being obnoxious, the criticism sometimes is, oh, the guy must be a virgin, if he's being misogynistic or something. So there's a lot of attitudes that really stigmatise virginity. And then for those who are voluntary incels, that is for religious reasons or whatever, they tend to be kind of accepting of it. They think, okay, well, people take the piss, but this is my choice. It's far worse for people in an involuntary position, because not only are they dealing with the social stigma and the ridicule, but they're missing out. They're dealing with that loneliness and frustration that comes with it. So why are people in this position? Well, firstly, I think like I say, it's part of our culture that people boast about losing their virginity in their early 20s or their teens. And by the way, I'm not passing any judgment there. I don't think there's anything wrong with that fundamentally, as long as it's consensual. But that's it. That's a kind of mark-off point. So if you're above the, let's say, mid-20s, then you're going to find yourself in the bracket where you are probably in the minority, and you're dealing with the stigma that comes with that. So let me just be upfront here. I lost my virginity pretty late, my late 20s. Now, I'd had some degree of intimacy with women before that. It's not like I was very, very shy and I'd never spoken to a girl. I'd had sort of girlfriends, on and off, not as much as I would have liked, but for me the issue, you see, was never really confidence in talking to women. I was relatively confident. I was relatively comfortable. I've always got on well with women. I've never had a thing where, oh, girls scary, so I never really had of course it was harder going from A to B, to go from friend to will you be my girlfriend. Sometimes I was rejected and sometimes not, so I had mixed luck. But like I say, I would have had one regret. I would have liked to have had more relationship experience. I have had girlfriends, but not the sort of experience I would have liked, the level of experience, because I do think that was one factor in my prolonged wait. Now, as it happened, I'm not going to go into details about the precise thing, A, because I'm a gentleman and out of respect for the lady involved, but also just it was a very special thing for me. And if I plaster it all over online, it's kind of ruins that. But I do want to just touch on it, not the details, but just some of the things around it. It came when I wasn't expecting it. And this is also true of finding a boyfriend or a girlfriend. It sounds like a cliche, but it is true. Often it will come when you're not expecting it. So when I lost my virginity, it wasn't a really awkward situation, because the person I was with, I was very comfortable with her, she was comfortable with me. It just kind of developed. And I'm so grateful that it did, because if I was still in that position, I'm now 34. If I was still in that position, I it's scary to think what that would do to my mental health, because it had a significant impact on my mental health up until that point. I'm sorry, by the way, but I'm trying to keep this steady, just try and get the right lighting. Yeah, university, I naturally in that sort of social environment, I saw lots of women I was very attracted to. But the loneliness I felt was just horrendous. It was really difficult. And I never considered myself a shy person, so this wasn't a case of I just was in my room all day and I never spoke to anyone. I did. I was very social actually, but it just, behind that, the loneliness I was going through was destroying me. I was binge drinking as a result of it. And so years later this thing finally happened. It wasn't a one night stand. I was kind of dating this girl, and I, by the way, just for the record, I don't have any moral issues about sex before marriage. I'm not that religious, so that was never an issue for me or her, as it turned out. But that just developed because we were both comfortable at the time. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, one night sort of like going to bars and stuff is not the way to do this. I think it's risky because people are drunk, they don't know what they're agreeing to. Especially if you're a guy, you have to be very careful there, because you could end up in hot water. Just, for me it's just not the best way to find someone. Now maybe someone else would have another experience, I don't know. But the point I'm trying to drive here is that I have enormous sympathy for people who are in this position. You may be in your 20s, you may be my age, you may be older. I'm not going to say, oh, heads up, everything will be fine, because I know how difficult that is. I really, really do. But put it this way, I was in my late 20s and I genuinely believed it's never going to happen for me. And it did. It did. And it was a very pleasant experience. Now, it's been a while at this point, so I haven't, it's not as if it's kind of followed up from that and I've just been having a great old time. I've been single now for quite a long time. What you find though with virginity, a lot of it ties into social situation. So if you're unemployed, if you're financially unstable, that obviously limits opportunities, because it limits, getting out, travelling, going to parties, seeing people. So for me, being single now, I don't particularly like it, but it's not my major priority, because I'm confident that when I stabilise myself, then that will follow up, because it's happened before. So although I'd love to have a girlfriend, it's not like something I'm going out of my way to find, because right now I'm not that financially stable and I don't want to be in a position where I can't offer anything to her. Like nothing. So I'm comfortable enough kind of biding my time. Like I say, if I was still in that position of virginity, I think it would really kill me. So this is what people need to understand when they make their crude little virginity jokes. They may think it's banter, but this thing does cause an enormous amount of unhappiness. So what's the answer? Dating sites are okay to an extent, but there is a caveat with that. Most of them you have to pay for. So if you're not in a financially stable position, it's difficult to make a regular contractual sort of agreement with something like that. Point one. Point two, I have friends who are on dating sites. I mean, in their case, it's gay dating sites, but you get a lot of frustration because people kind of give you the impression they're interested, then they just don't contact you again. I think that was another thing that put me off dating sites. So I would urge people to be a little bit cautious with that. I think it would take a lot of patience, because you may find someone that's very compatible and then they just don't get back to you. And also there's a security issue. Do you really know that the beautiful young woman you're looking at, or the handsome guy, is that really who they say they are? So it's a bit of a security issue there as well. People don't get, people who aren't in this position also misunderstand it. They think that if you complain about it, and most people don't because it is a stigma, they don't openly talk about it, but people who feel frustrated by this, people who feel the loneliness I was talking about, oh, they're only interested in sex, that really angers me, because that is such a judgmental, self-righteous notion. How can someone who has had that experience be smug and self-righteous with someone who hasn't, and judge them and say you're only interested in sex? Because I guarantee you, unless you're a virgin for religious reasons, if you're in their position, will feel exactly the same thing. The desire for sexual intimacy is one of the most basic human desires. So anyone that genuinely says they're not interested, they're either asexual, which is fine. Like I say, there is a phenomenon in society, some people do feel that way, where they're just not interested in sex, or they're religious. And again, I respect that, provided they're not imposing it on anyone else. That's their choice. It's religious freedom. They just prefer to wait for marriage. I couldn't do that, because even if I was a devout Christian, I'd find that a real struggle, because then you have to wait for the right woman or man for marriage, which is again the waiting game, isn't it? So whilst I respect that religious position, I personally couldn't commit to it. And I also think some people, religious people, are a bit judgmental. They tend to look down on others as being sleeping around. Some people do, but in most cases it's just, I suspect most people are not as active as they maybe would like to say they are. So, the really braggadocious guy boasting in the pub about pulling the birds, sometimes it may be partly true, but a lot of the time it's hot air. People just want to big themselves up, and you get female equivalents as well. So it's important for those who are going through virginity, going through this experience, to remember that other people may not be getting it as much as you think. Maybe, my thing used to be, well, any is better than none. And it's true. I've had that experience, but that was some time ago now, and I would like to have it again. So some is definitely better than none if you're going through what I'm talking about. But that is an important caveat. A lot of people who, for example, make virgin jokes, you probably find they're not as active as you might think, or they may be married but they're getting no sex because they've got young children. There's a lot of commitments going on, or maybe it sounds almost a travesty to talk about bad sex when you're getting none, but if it brings about a lot of complications, that is another thing to consider. So what's the answer to this? Well, this is going to be a controversial point, but I think at the very least it needs to be discussed, and that is the sex trade being more regulated. So at the moment in the UK and some other countries, the focus is prostitution's a bit of a grey area. So as I understand it, and I may be wrong about this, as I understand it, soliciting for sex is not illegal in itself, but buying sex is. Now that's a bit strange, because it's a bit like saying producing cigarettes isn't illegal, but smoking them is. Okay, it might be a crude analogy, but it just makes no sense. If you're going to say that sex workers can legally work, but if someone buys from them, they're breaking the law, all that's going to do is scare off clients, which means that those women and men who are in the sex trade aren't getting an income, because very often they're doing it for financial reasons. So that leaves them more financially vulnerable. But I also think treating clients, and this is going to be a controversial point, as horrible criminals is misguided, because for some people they may be limited by social barriers, they may be limited by disability, they may be limited by a range of reasons to getting sex in the normal way, because And again, this is something where people get self-righteous. Not everyone could just go up into a bar and say, hey babe, do you want to go to bed tonight? You know? So, okay, there's the stereotype of clients being sleazy middle-aged businessmen. But the way I see it is, you cannot compare a consensual situation, even if it isn't, you know, particularly classy, paying money for sex, with, for example, rape or trafficking children or something like that. I think where there are problems in the industry, it's precisely because there are legal issues around it. So it is driven underground, and it is driven into the hands of criminals. And this is true with many things. Although I'm not suggesting that that's the same with every sort of, like, oh, legalise everything and it'll be fine. I'm not for a second saying that, because I don't think it's the same in the drug world. But I do think there should be a situation where there are licensed red light districts, and they wouldn't be very obvious. There wouldn't be, you know, oh, well, this is the brothels of this city. But there has to be a situation which improves safety for sex workers, but also doesn't vilify clients, because that's a side that isn't spoken about. You know, feminists often say, oh, well, men have the power. Is that really so? If a man is in this desperate situation, and he maybe just doesn't have the avenue for other means, then in a free society, surely, this is going to be controversial, but surely he or she, for that matter, if it's a woman, surely they should have the freedom to be able to have those opportunities. If the sex worker is, I mean, it's a mutual thing. The sex worker's getting money, they're getting sex. Yet the focus is entirely on, oh, well, the sex. He's in the position of power. But, you know, you hear of situations of clients being robbed by pimps, and they're not going to go to the police because they're potentially breaking the law. So I think we need to change the mentality and the stereotypes around clients. I mean, this idea they're all sleazy, middle-aged businessmen cheating on their wives, it's wrong, I think. Just for the record, I think very carefully about visiting sex workers because of the legal issues. You know, I don't want to be fined or worse. So I honestly think that's something we need a much more candid discussion about. And unfortunately, the debate right now is that there is rightly focus on the safety of sex workers, but there is too much vilification of clients. And the feminist notion that they have all the power, I think, is misleading. I think it's not entirely true. You know, that is something that needs to be looked at. Goodness me, 22 minutes. I hadn't intended to speak for so long, but you know, this is a very important issue. What else can be done? People in this position, I'm not going to patronise them and say, oh, everything's going to be fine, just hold your head up. I know how frustrating and lonely that is. I would say sex is a very pleasurable experience, but you may get something of an anticlimax afterwards. And the way I felt at the time before it happened with me was, well, I don't care. I just want the experience, and that is true. But if it's any sort of comfort whatsoever, well, I know it's not. That's almost a silly thing to say, because it's just like, if you haven't tried something, you can live with, oh well, it wasn't quite what expected, but it's the not knowing, it's the new experience, that is the thing. And you know, we really need to just try and drop the stigma around this, and try to be a little bit more less callous about people who are going through this, because it's all very well to have banter. I mean, a group of lads, you know, if they have one friend and they're always taking the piss out of him for being a virgin, they're not friends, they're assholes, period. Now, it's different if they're trying to help him and they're trying to find a girl for him or something, but if they're just taking the piss for the sake of it, he should drop them. Like, you know, they're not friends, they're absolutely not friends. And if you are a young person and you're in this sort of social dynamic and you see this, just don't, you know, try and put yourself in that person's position. because the amount of loneliness this causes, I honestly think it could probably even lead to suicides. I wouldn't be surprised. You know, we hear of suicides often being related to problems within relationships or financial problems, but loneliness is probably a killer. And I don't think we can have an honest look at this without looking at everything. So, for example, what I mentioned about the sex work, how can we have an honest debate about prostitution if it's just going to be a case of, oh, let's vilify clients? I don't think it's the best way to go for sex. I don't. But in the real world, not everyone has the luxury of just going up and meeting someone. So if they go to a sex worker, it's consensual, she's an adult or he is an adult, and they're willing to take money in exchange for sex, that is a mutual contract. But again, you know, critics of, or people who vilify clients are just like, they're only focusing on, oh, he or she is getting sex, particularly he. They're not focusing on the fact the sex worker is getting money. So it's a mutual thing. And sometimes clients are ripped off. Now, like any other, if it were to be treated as, and obviously it's not, but if it were to be treated as sell and buy, you know, demand and supply, if you were ripped off in any other sort of exchange, you know, you'd be a victim of fraud. So I think when it comes to prostitution, there needs to be a change in attitude to clients. And there's another thing about that. If a sex worker is a victim of violence, say from another client or from her pimp, it could be that the client, like her previous client, is the only witness, and he will be reluctant to go to police because he could have broken the law by soliciting. So I think we need to stop vilifying clients. I'm not saying there aren't sleazy clients out there, you know, people who maybe are cheating on their partners or whatever. It's wrong, but who am I to judge that? I mean, the point here is there's a lot of areas around this that just need to be looked at. In my opinion, everyone, at least once in their life, should have a mutual, consensual sexual experience. At least once. Some people get it more than others, and I honestly believe, as much as I like women, as much as I am very attracted to women, I honestly think sex every day, you would at some point, you know, it's like Christmas, you appreciate it more when it comes less. I honestly think it would be the same thing with sex. Having said that, I'd like to get more than I'm getting, which is none right now, and that's been the case for a while, but I wanted to be very open here and talk about my experience when I was a virgin, and I lost it in my late 20s. It came when I wasn't expecting it. Thank God it did. But to, you know, anyone out there, I feel that I know what you're going through, and just remember it may well come when you're not expecting it. Do try and get out though. That is definitely, if you can, if you have the financial means, try and get out. If you don't have the financial means, focus on that first. And just remember, this is a guy who, you know, waited for years and years and years. Okay, some people have waited longer, but I waited a lot longer than a lot of my peers, and it was bloody tough, believe me. So that's why I feel I'm in a position to say these things. Okay, let me know your thoughts and your own experience. And anyone cracking jokes about virginity, you're wasting your time. Because the thing is, now that doesn't bother me on a personal level. It bothers me for other people because I know what that's like. But on a personal level, it's impossible because I'm not a virgin anyway. It's not. And I don't think it should be a mark of stigma for those who... I'll just close with this. For those who do choose it, fair enough to them. You know, that's their choice. But I think in most cases it's a case of just not getting the opportunities. So what I would say finally is, I know what it's like. Try and not to feel total despair, because you may find that circumstances in your life change unexpectedly. That's what happened with me. It can happen. So please hold in there and talk. That's another thing. If nothing else, I mean, You may find just being candid in a video like this, maybe you don't want to show your face even, but just talk to me, inbox me, leave a comment. I'll be happy to try and get back to you on this one. I know I've been pretty sloppy in that regard recently, but on this video, if you're in this position, I'll be happy to listen to you. I'm not saying I'll have advice, I'm not an agony uncle, but I can empathise. So if it helps, you want to send a message to me, getting off your chest, believe me, it helps, because on my channel you're not going to be judged, so this is one avenue at least, you're not going to be judged, and talk about it. Thanks for watching.